Hello there and welcome to this light cruiser guide. My name is Stealth. I do a lot of videos on Admiral Dreadnoughts, helping people to get into the game by understanding some basic mechanics and how various ship classes work. And this one is about light cruisers. First thing you need to know is that in Admiral Dreadnoughts there is a sort of food chain. It's a circular food chain. Battleships do very well against battle cruisers. Do they also do well against heavy cruisers? Yes, most of the time. They can also defeat light cruisers, but when it comes to defeating destroyers, that's where they start to struggle. The battle cruisers, similarly, are very good at engaging heavy cruisers and light cruisers, but also don't do that well against destroyers, because they might be a bit too nimble, a bit too small and too fast to fight. The light cruisers are there to engage destroyers. They are there as a sort of hunter against destroyers. That's their natural prey. They can also, depending on the era and tech that you have, be useful against battleships. Especially with their torpedo capabilities, they can throw out some torps. On this particular hull, it is just one torpedo launcher. It's not really going to be useful. But when you're looking at, let's say, a 1925 light cruiser, you're already getting some serious firepower. Because you can start adding a quintuple, so that's 5 torpedo launchers, and with that, you'll be able to hunt down battleships. Now in this guide we're going to talk about a bit more about what is the role of a light cruiser, what can you expect from a light cruiser early game, what sort of build should you go for early game, and then a bit more late game, what sort of build should you go for then. Now to first start off with that mission profile. Your job as a light cruiser is to engage destroyers. That's one. You're there to keep these pesky little boats from torpedoing your bigger ships. So your dreadnoughts, sometimes even your battle cruisers if you have them. This is 1910, you might not have battle cruisers then, depending on how fast you've teched up in the campaign. What a light cruiser can also do in a battle is lay a smokescreen. It shares this feature with the destroyers. And a ship that is inside of a smokescreen, or that has a smokescreen in front of it, is more difficult to hit. This, however, works both ways. So let's say that you have your battleship, which is inside of a smokescreen, or just behind a smokescreen that's laid by your light cruiser. In that case, your battleship is going to be more difficult to hit. But because your battleship is also trying to see through the smoke itself, it also gets an accuracy debuff. So this means that this smokescreen works both ways. The smokescreen can also be working for the light cruiser itself. You smoke yourself up and you become more difficult to hit. And this can be useful if you're trying to either extricate the light cruiser from a battle, or push the light cruiser into a battle. Because depending on how you build these things out, they can in fact become useful as a sort of heavy destroyer. They can be useful when you're trying to deal damage against a battleship by going against them with a torpedo attack. There's also a third role for these ships. This is a bit more off-screen, if you will, and really strictly relates to the campaign. At some point in the campaign, you're going to be looking at enemy submarines. You don't see them, they're not actually inside of a battle, but on the map, they're there. If you do not address the enemy submarine threat, your battleships, your heavy cruisers, your battle cruisers will start to suffer. So over here on the right-hand side, you have a detection called ASW, Anti-Submarine Warfare. Various ships get various basic stats, so looking for example at the light cruiser 4, you get 16.64, you get 16.95, and you get 17.16. You can boost these values by going at it with various equipment. If you get a front tower, that immediately gives you a boost to ASW. If you also get, for example, a radio direction finder or an advanced radio, that also helps with defeating anti-submarines or defeating submarines. Now this is a bit, how shall I put it, a bit vague. The game doesn't really explain it. The way that you're looking to fight submarines is you have a high submarine or ASW stat, they have an attack stat, and just trying to see if you can get a higher ASW stat than their attack stat, that's basically how it works. The game doesn't really explain it more than that. So try to boost this ASW stat as much as possible, and this is something that light cruisers can do and destroyers can do too. When it comes to, let's say, a later era, maybe 1920, if you install a bigger tower, There we go. You're also going to get access to the hydroacoustics, underwater acoustics, and this also boosts your ASW stats significantly. So you can see that this ship right now is already pretty potent in dealing with submarines. If you also throw on, or well, rather throw out depth charges, you'll be able to deal with submarines even better. All of these stats do help you to defend your fleet against enemy submarines. So this is something that the light cruiser can do outside of a battle. And that's a bit weird. It's not something that you really see, but it's more of a strategic, let's say, defense against destroyers. Sorry, against submarines. And if you don't have them, you might suffer the consequences. Yet another role for these ships can be merchant raiding. For this, you have to have, let's say, a relatively fast ship, and this is something that the light cruiser can do perfectly well. A light cruiser capable of engaging a convoy might encounter some different defenses. The enemy heavy cruiser, for example, might not be that pleased that you're trying to engage their convoy. They might even have a battleship or a battle cruiser defending it. In such a case, a light cruiser is usually faster, and you can use that level of speed to try and circumnavigate the battleship. So you can try to get around the battleship, and as such, just completely negate its impact, while, for example, popping your smokescreen, just try and stay alive, and try and have a go at the convoy that way, and then disengage. Don't try to fight a battleship. That is, unless the battleship is really badly wounded, maybe doesn't have any armor, or you have a boatload, no pun intended, of torpedoes that you can throw at the battleship. So that's another role for the light cruiser. Now, when it comes to building these things out, you have a couple of different ways of going about it. Early game, you don't really have a lot of options. The light cruiser early game, I'd say, is almost not worth it. The reason for that is that these ships tend to be slow. For example, this semi-armored cruiser is running at 21.5 knots. Their prey, a destroyer, can run at a maximum optimal speed of 34 knots. So this thing is about 50% faster than you are, and you'll never catch it. To that end, I'd say pick a ship, at least a hull, with a better maximum optimal speed. And this also directly ties into the hull form stat. The hull form says how sleek a ship is and how easily it moves through the water. The better the hull form, the better the ship most likely has an optimal cruising speed. So the Light Cruiser 4 at 27.5 is currently the best option that you have. So let's say I want to build these things out to defend the fleet against enemy destroyers. I would not necessarily really need a massive light cruiser. It's potentially overkill. And considering that light cruisers generally don't have a lot of armor, you cannot armor them up that much. I mean, I can type that I want 8 inches of armor, but the game is going to say, nope, sorry, can't do that. 2.7 inches is the maximum. This means this ship is vulnerable to everything. And in this case, the survivability of the ship is almost directly related to how big of a target you are. So in this case, I would want a very small light cruiser. At 8,000 tons, I'm still significantly larger than my prey, which is going to be about 1,500 tons. I can also make the ship even smaller by reducing the beam. This means that the width of the ship changes, and as such, the ship becomes sleeker. This again makes it a smaller target, because we just went from 8,000 tons to 7,500. If you also reduce the draft, you're becoming smaller still, and you're also making the ship cheaper while you're doing it. Now, these things do have an impact on how well your ship is going to be likely to survive. Because if you're scrolling back up to the stats, you can see that a -9 beam does give you less of a base accuracy. Less draft does give you an increase in base accuracy. These things kind of cancel each other out. The same can be said for the flooding chance, which is the 5th line there. -15% flooding chance. However, if you look at the beam, you get more flooding chance. Don't look too much into these things. I'm just building a light cruiser that's capable of intercepting destroyers. Now, that first change I made, the lesser beam, the smaller, the less wide ship, this means that the ship doesn't need as much engine power to go through the water. However, it's also less stable. And the game does explain that a little bit. It says a wider hull is a more stable firing platform and has an increased displacement and resistance, but is generally slower. This thing is much more maneuverable, but it's also a bit less stable. It's going to give you that accuracy reduction, which again is kind of cancelled out by the lower draft. The draft, in case you're not familiar with it, is, let's say, how tall a ship is. You can see that I can change the stat and the ship kind of grows vertically. Now, with a relatively small ship like this, coming in at just under 7,000 tons, we have a pretty mobile platform. And if I do put this at 27.5 knots, we don't need tons and tons of engine power in order to propel the ship through the water. To showcase what the beam does if I increase the beam, so let's say I do a +9 or +10% beam, that gives you a different weight distribution. Currently I'm using 60% of the ship. If I'm going all the way up, I'm using 82% of the ship. Now this is because you need more engine power to throw a wider hull through the water. So in order to have a relatively fast ship, you want to have less beam, because it means that you're just sleeker. Just, let's say, imagine something that is less wide that you're trying to push through the water. A dart generally goes through the water a bit more easily than, for example, a saucer does. So in that case, a beam of -9% in this case really helps. If you're looking at the campaign, and that's what I'm building this for, the crew stats don't really matter that much. You won't have training, but you will have quarters. And this indicates how many crew members you have. If you have cramped crew quarters, then every time that somebody dies on the ship, you're going to see less efficiency aboard the ship. You'll have less reload. Your damage control is going to suffer. All of these things are directly tied to how much crew you have. I would recommend setting it to standard. If you go with a cruiser that might go into harm's way more, go for spacious crew quarters. But this is something that I tend to reserve mostly for battleships. Ships that I know that will get shot at a lot. When it comes to dealing with crew aboard light cruisers, well, it's usually the light cruiser itself that goes down before the whole crew dies. So in that sense, you don't really need it. When it comes to propulsion, I tend to pick whatever engine I have that is best. And I'm also constantly looking at how much am I, let's say, paying for that engine in weight. Of course, getting a better engine, or at least usually a more teched up engine, does increase the price of the ship. So if you're looking for a fleet of light cruisers that are cheap, and you don't need to put a whole lot of stuff on them, you can go for an older engine. I'm currently only paying 17 million for this, as opposed to 22 million, and this is without any gear aboard this light cruiser. In this case, I'm going to be building this light cruiser out as a destroyer interceptor. And as such, I need something that is relatively quick. So I want to get the steam turbines. I want to get, well, let's see how many funnels I need to get up to, yeah. Engine efficiency is quite low. Engine efficiency is one of the other stats that really ties into how well a ship does. If you have a low engine efficiency, you're going to see far less acceleration. Your operational range decreases, your cruising speed decreases, but thankfully with the propulsion stat here, the boilers, you can change this. Some engines won't have boilers, but some of them, such as this one, do. And pushing this thing to forced boilers does give you some very serious engine cost increase, but it also means that your engine is twice as efficient. This also means that you might not need a second funnel. And the less weight that you spend on an engine, the more weight is potentially going to be available for other gear, guns, detection capabilities, armor, stuff like that. In the case of a destroyer hunter such as this light cruiser, it's also handy to have all of this acceleration power. Because with this 133% acceleration, engine efficiency, you're getting 100% extra acceleration. Which means that if you lose speed, because for example you're turning, you'll be able to regain that speed very quickly. And if you're engaging a destroyer, there's a very good chance that that destroyer is not going to take kindly to that and will in fact throw torpedoes at you. That means you're going to be turning and you're going to have to try and once again catch up to the damn destroyer. So that is when you need all of this acceleration, and I highly recommend that you go for, let's say, around 100% engine efficiency, which means I'm a little over. I can try to go back to induced, and that does save me a bit of weight, it saves me a bit of money, and it saves me a bit of engine efficiency. With this, I can do still 60% bonus acceleration, which for this particular ship right now, I will accept. As for the rest of the gear, Having auxiliary engines on any ship is very useful. Additional turning rate, additional rudder shift speed, additional turret traverse speed, additional water pumping, it's all very useful. And on top of that, considering you're a light cruiser, speed is life. If you are dead in the water, that means you don't have any engine power, you don't have any speed, you're very likely going to be dead soon. So having at least some engine capability, so let's say you have a damaged engine and you don't get as much of a penalty, is useful. So I highly recommend an auxiliary diesel engine. As for propeller shafts, just get the basic one if you can. It does give you, again, a bit more acceleration and a bit more turning rate, so your ship is faster to turn around. When it comes to the rudder, you've got the semi-balanced rudder, which is what you normally get. Then you have the balanced rudder giving you more sustained speed while turning, so you don't lose as much speed in a turn. Your rudder shifts faster, but the ship actually turns slower. This is not really something I recommend, because if you look at the minimum turning circle at 294, at least currently, before putting on a lot of additional weight to the ship, this is going to go up. Your turning rate, or your turning circle, is now 389. I want to get this as low as possible. I want to get this to 225. Because if there is a torpedo in the water, I want to be able to dodge it. So I want to be able to lose speed. This is something I actually want. I don't want to have all that speed, because the slower a ship is, the faster it'll be able to turn. And this way your turning rate improves, your rudder doesn't shift as quickly, nor can you have as much acceleration because, well, you are turning. But this is again where it ties into that engine efficiency. I might lose speed in the turn, and I want to. But after I'm done turning and dodging, I want to get that acceleration back up. So that's why I'm going with an unbalanced rudder. And then for the different types of steering, I recommend that you just generally take the best, because it does boost your turning rate and rudder shift speed. The problem is that sometimes you will see that the ship gets more flaws. Now, a ship flaw is basically a ship doesn't get built to spec. So you might have this ship completely laid out and the shipyard makes all sorts of mistakes because the ship workers aren't exactly as clever as you might like. This means that the ship might not have as much engine power that you want. Generally, ship flaws are a bit annoying, but especially later game, they're not that big of a deal. So I'm going to take this, and now my turning circle is 188 meters. Don't pin yourself down on this turning circle, because the turning circle generally isn't even true. This might sound a bit weird, but I have had it happen where the game says, yeah, you can turn in, I don't know, 500 meters. And you're actually in battle at flank speed. And the ship is going, yeah, no, this is cool. We're going to be turning around in about 2.5 kilometers. So don't take too much this turning circle as your guideline. All right, then we have at least a bit of the basic ship setup. We have engines, we have propulsion. Get the best armor that you can. Armor is life for these things, much like speed. And the better your armor generally is, yes, you're paying more for it, but you're also not using as much weight for it. The amount of weight that I had on the ship actually went down from 48% to 46%. So my armor quality improves, but I don't have as much weight for the armor. The next stat you have is how many hull bottoms you have. You can go for single, double, or triple, depending on whether or not you have the tech. I generally don't find this to be that useful. If you take a torpedo, it reduces the flooding chance, and it also gives you a flat 4.5% chance, or 4.5% resistance, which means that if you take a hit, it's not as likely to go through. It does, however, make the ship substantially heavier, especially the bigger the ship. So, considering the bonuses and the fact that my ship is very likely to dodge, I don't want a double hull bottom. I do want reinforced bulkheads, because this reduces the chance of fire. It also increases the speed of extinguishing said fire, and there is less chance of a flash fire. A flash fire, in case you're unaware of what that is, sometimes you might have a gun and the magazine underneath that gun takes a hit. The gun can then go flying off the ship in a massive explosion, giving the ship a lot of damage and sometimes even burning up all the ammo that you have on the ship. Not necessarily what you want. So always go for maximum survivability with reinforced bulkheads and maximum bulkheads on the slider. I didn't actually talk about this, but the more bulkheads you have, the better it is. The AI is something that you'll generally see use few bulkheads or standard or sometimes many. I always use maximum bulkheads. This is not a discussion. I always use maximum bulkheads. If you do take a hit and your ship starts taking on water, you want as much anti-flood as you can, so max that out and get the best citadel that you can. This is the protection that, let's say, the core of the ship has, where the, well, let's say the internal organs of the ship are. And now to build the ship out. What sort of tower, what sort of gear do we want? Considering that this ship is probably, if it's a campaign ship, going to be around for quite a while, I want to get the best gear on there. Because the best towers also give you more capabilities. They give you better spotting, they warn you about torpedoes sooner, which is very welcome. They give you better long-range accuracy, they give you better base accuracy, so the main tower is going to be the front tower 6. I'm trying to push this thing as far back as possible. And if you hold control, you're not going to be beholden to these couple of points that the game says, but you can kind of drag it back in very small increments. So I'm going to put it right there, so that I still have some room for a gun on the bow. This is useful because I might want to be chasing down a target. As for a secondary tower, I'm really hoping it's going to fit there, but it doesn't. Sometimes the game doesn't show you that it can fit there. So holding control and then dragging it over sometimes gives you the option to place it there. This time around, it doesn't. So I'm going to have to just plunk it down there. When it comes to gear, I do recommend that you have a coincidence rangefinder because stereoscopic boosts your long-range accuracy. Well, let's be honest, early game, your accuracy is dreadful anyway. You're definitely not going to be hitting anything at long range, let alone something as small as a destroyer. So a coincidence rangefinder is much more useful. Base gun aiming speed increases by 80% and you get more base accuracy. When it comes to radios, definitely get the improved radio telegraph because it does improve your ASW capabilities. And when it comes to mine laying, in this case, if it's a destroyer hunter, I don't need to deploy mines. If you, however, find yourself in a bit of an asymmetric conflict against an enemy nation that has way more firepower than you, you can overhaul, so refit your ships to have mine-laying capabilities. And does this mean that you're going to be laying mines around your ports? Don't worry, won't hit you, it'll only hit the enemy, and it might actually cause quite a bit of damage to their ships. There is a bit of a downside to deploying mines, or at least having mines aboard. There is an increase in ammo detonation chance. I don't want that, so for this particular build, I'm not going with any mines. Now, I'm going to max out the armor, especially forebelt, main belt, aft belt. Main belt is the core of the ship, and you can see that as indicated with these markers. Everything in front of it is forebelt, everything behind it is aft belt, but this thing moves. That might sound a little weird, but if I add a main gun, so let's say just a 6-inch placeholder, suddenly I have less of a forebelt, because the main belt covers everything from the foremost gun to the aftmost gun. So having another gun, for example, let's say pushing it further forward, you can see that the mechanic or the section display changes. Having then another gun on the stern can also really get you a massive, massive belt. And as such, if you start to change the main belt, you see that this number up here, the weight, changes far faster than when I do forebelt and aft belt, simply because there isn't that much forebelt and aft belt. Now the good news is, if you have a very small citadel, so I would have one gun there and one gun there, I can have a pretty heavily armored main belt, and I don't necessarily need as much on the front and the aft, because there's nothing critical in there. It's just buoyancy, but there's nothing that can explode, generally. Nevertheless, considering that the light cruisers can't exactly get a whole lot of armor, I'm just going to put as much on there as possible. Deck hits, yeah, it's generally useful if you're looking at plunging fire. So let's say a shell doesn't come in like this, it doesn't come in flat and ricochets off the ship, but it comes in from very far and it just kind of goes into the ship like that. That is plunging fire, and that is something that you can defend against with deck armor. I'm going to say 2 inches everywhere. The chance of it actually stopping anything is not that good, but I'd rather have it than not. Conning tower armor is very important, so if you can, just max it out, because it basically doesn't move the needle that much. It's currently maxed out on 6 inches. And superstructure, everything from funnels to main tower, secondary tower, that's all superstructure. The more damage you take to the superstructure, especially the main tower and the conning tower, the more likely you are to lose your accuracy as well as your damage control. So I generally tend to have this at least 2 to 3 inches to protect against incoming shell fire from potentially the destroyer that we're going to fight. Now, onto the Citadel armor. Once, let's say your outer armor gets penned, you then have the inner belt. So then you have a bit more armor. And as your Citadel level increases, you're going to have more of this. So in this case, I'm going to try and max this out at 1.4, and the inner deck, oh, I don't know. It probably won't have a lot of armor, but it might just be able to stop the shell if it did go through the foredeck, the aft deck, or the main deck. Then for the turret armor, I'm not going to discuss that yet because I first have to pick what sort of gun I want. Now this is going to be a pretty traditional ship, if you will. And by that I mean it is going to have, well, unfortunately no barbettes because they don't exist yet in 1910. You simply don't get access to those. So we're going to have to pick some guns. In this era, you can have, let's say, 4-inch guns, which can go on various positions of the ship. And the game is going to show you what sort of firing angles they have. Keep in mind what you are hunting. In this case, I'm hunting destroyers. And that means I want to have something that has a pretty decent rate of fire and is more likely to hit the DD. I don't need a big gun, because the destroyer doesn't have a lot of armor. I'm never going to hit a destroyer at 9-kilometer range unless I get really, really lucky. So just basically plunking down a couple of guns on this ship on the bow would be very helpful. Keep in mind, these guns, at least like this, the game is going to try and force you into using any of these positions. If you hold control, you can just ignore that and place it down wherever you want. With this particular setup, let's say I move this thing slightly back. If I'm lucky, I can get about 3 guns to target a DD. If it's, let's say, at the position of that warehouse. If it's on the position of the crane, I can target it with more or less 2, potentially 3 guns, depending on what my angle of the ship is. So this is going to give me at least some firepower against the DD. The DD might also show up behind me, so again, I'm going to have a couple of guns there. You can even put these things amidships on some ships, not all of them. And that's pretty much the firepower of the ship done. It's a DD hunter, and if this thing, for some reason, encounters a convoy, you can be sure that these 4-inch guns are going to make very quick work of a convoy. Merchantmen don't like getting hit by any kind of a gun. A 4-inch gun is good enough to sink merchantmen very quickly. We're going to have to, however, do something about what type of shells we're using. Right now we're using maximum HE, which means you don't get as many armor-piercing shells. Considering we're fighting destroyers, that's fine. I can get a couple of different choices for the type of fuse. Now, this means that you're going to be doing more, for example, fire damage. So you try and set the ship on fire and damage the ship that way. If you get enough fires on the ship, that will actually eliminate the ship. You also have the way of going all the way to the CPBC, Common Pointed Ballistic Capped Shell. Not nearly as much fire chance, but it does give you more shell pen. The problem is, I have a 4-inch gun. If you look at the bottom of that column, it says HE AP penetration belt / deck, and then it comes up with the accuracy. So let's say 2.5-kilometer range, because I don't really think I'm going to hit a destroyer at 5-kilometer range. You're looking at 0.2 inches of HE penetration against the belt, or you're looking at 0 inches of armor penetration against the deck. If I then change this to cap ballistic, this number is going to go up by a bit. Like, not much. You're looking at 0.6 now, and you're looking, here we go, you're looking at 0.2 now. So it does change a bit, but I generally don't need that much damage when I'm going up against a destroyer. So, yeah, this is probably fine, the 2 inches, or the 0.2 inches. It's fine. I don't need more HE damage. The side effect of this is that if I somehow encounter a battleship, I might actually be able to contribute some damage. Although, at this point, I'm going to have to be within, let's say, 5-kilometer range, and that means I'm likely also going to get shot at. So that's pretty bad news. Especially because a destroyer might not be able to damage my ship, but a battleship pretty likely can. This, however, does give me more flexibility, and I do like flexibility because I never know what sort of battle my ship is going to get into. Speaking of flexibility, I'm also going to add torpedo launchers to this particular build because they don't weigh that much and they can give you a hefty punch in an emergency. These things do a lot of damage, And this is, well, at least not telling the full story because the damage says 2198.7. But that is, let's say, an unmitigated damage. If somebody has some sort of anti-torpedo protection, that damage is going to get reduced. If they have more than a single hull bottom, that damage is going to get reduced. So all of these stats are, let's say, impacted by what sort of armor or protective measures the enemy has. When it comes to these torpedoes, I generally try to max out the size, and I don't need to bring more. If you want to do fast torpedoes, you can. This is going to make sure the torpedo is very fast, but the torpedo range suffers a lot. In this case, I only have 4 kilometer torpedo range, which means that I'm going to have to get really close to something like a battleship in order to try and sink it, or at least to try and torpedo it. So in this case, I'll be perfectly happy taking standard torpedoes. When it comes to the type of propellant and the type of bursting charge you use, I generally try to go for the most advanced, but keep an eye on damage control stat, flash fire chance. The higher this is, the more likely your ship is to start getting destroyed by flash fires the moment that something hits you. Sometimes you get these numbers up really high. For example, picric acid improves the chances where, well, you're more likely to spontaneously combust. So in this case, picric acid might look very nice because yes, it gives you 37.5% more shell damage. Yeah, but your flash fire chance goes up pretty much significantly. For Dunite, it's even worse. So I'm going to pick TNT because I don't want to get a couple of detonations going on aboard my ship. Now, at this point, we have added the guns to the ship, and unfortunately, because they're 4-inch guns, they cannot actually get any armor. That sucks. We can't actually armor these things up. We can, however, change the barrel length, and we can change the diameter. So with that, you can change these 4-inch guns to be 4.9-inch guns. The reason why you would potentially want to do this is, 1, roleplay. You want to have, let's say, a 4.5-inch gun because historical reasons. Or 2, you have a gun which has a higher mark. For example, I can't exactly show you here. Sometimes you're going to get a Mark II gun, sometimes you're going to get a Mark III gun. The mark, let's say the higher mark, the better the gun is. But you might have a 6-inch Mark III, but a 7-inch Mark II. In that case, I will pick the 6-inch Mark III. And I'm going to increase that by using this diameter booster. So I'm going to get a 6.9-inch Mark III gun, which is still going to be better than a 7-inch Mark II. It's a bit technical, but once you get to compare these guns more effectively, you'll see what I mean. As for barrel length, this can go up, again, depending on the type of tech that you have. Currently, I can only do 12% longer barrels. The longer the barrel is, the longer the reach of the gun is. But you're also suffering from additional reload. My reload is now 15 seconds. And right now, it is 11.5 seconds. Also, keep an eye on the accuracy. So let's go for 5,000 meter range. I have 2.2 to 2.3% chance to hit something. If I then increase that, I'm going to go up to 3.2 and 3.4, but I'm actually getting a chance to hit something at 7.5 kilometer range. In this case, I don't really want that, because I'm not that likely to hit something at 7.5 kilometer range anyway, and I do want to throw out a lot more shells. To that end, you could argue, well, take a buzzsaw to the barrels and make them shorter by taking them down to minus 20%. But if you do that, your HE range suffers to 3.8. And yes, you might be throwing out a lot of shells, but good lord, their accuracy is atrocious and their range is bad. So in this case, I'm not going to go with any change here, but this is something that you can definitely play around with. On ships that have, let's say, more standoffish range, which is the second build later in this video, I'm going to have more barrel length. Now, at this point, we have 81% of the hull used. This means I can still use some more of the hull. I can't exactly put on more guns, at least not main guns, but the ship also has these sort of weird-looking slots, casemates. This is where I'm going to add a couple of 3-inch guns to boost the firepower of the ship even more. They can also have some over there. We can have some on the tower. And this means that we're going to be boosting the firepower of this ship. Now, with these guns, you're going to be throwing out shells a little faster. These have a reload of only 5.5 seconds, as opposed to the 4-inch guns, which are looking at 11.5 seconds. So it's again a nice damage booster. Your range is only 5.4 as opposed to 6.2. That is high explosive range or HE range. So yeah, you'll be able to throw out a bit more shells, but you need to get slightly closer. But I want my guns all to be in range at the same time. So this is when I am going to boost the barrel length of these 3-inchers. And now we should be pretty even. The 3-inchers are coming at a range of 6.7, and these things are coming at a range of 6.2. So maybe I can do just 5%, 6.0, and 6.2. Yeah, that's good. I'm getting slightly more accuracy, I'm getting slightly more reload, but I'm also getting slightly more range. So right now, if a destroyer comes into, let's say, or if I'm chasing a destroyer and I'm going after it, I'm going to be able to fire at it with the 4-inch guns, but also with a bunch of these 3-inch casemates. And that means that the destroyer is more likely to take a hit, start flooding, and potentially be a much easier prey to finish off. Now, what are you going to do with the rest of that displacement? Up to you. You can increase the armor to, let's say, the maximum values, and then we're still lacking. You can increase the speed. Be aware that the game has a sort of magic speed number, if you will, where it suddenly drastically increases the weight. Right now, it's not that bad. If I go to 31, and there we go. That's suddenly 400 tons that gets added. 32 knots, 300 tons, 34 knots. This is going to get worse, and the price of the ship also increases and your engine efficiency goes down. Now, because I want these ships to be quite numerous, I'm going to go with, let's say, 27, maybe 28 knots. Engine efficiency drops a bit, price goes up a bit, but it's fine. What you can also get, additional range. Operational range is going to give you, at least according to the game, increases operational usefulness. Right, that says absolutely nothing. Increases probability of convoy raids. That is useful because it might mean that you're going to be in a situation where you can engage an enemy convoy. And the more convoy ships you destroy, the more likely you are to be able to economically cripple your enemy. Increases probability of favorable naval missions. Again, this is such a vague stat that I generally don't pay attention to it. And it decreases maintenance penalty in distant travels. The farther a ship is from home, the more likely you are to be paying a lot to get it supplied. So this is capable of going a bit farther without getting that penalty. Fuel storage and consumption do increase the ship's cost. Not by that much. 81.7 million is what we're paying for it right now versus 80.5. It's not that bad. So that's the ship that I would go for with, let's say, a destroyer hunter role. Now, let's build another one. I'm going to go with a, let's say, United States light cruiser in the 1940s. Different role, different mission profile. This thing is going to be capable of intercepting convoys, as well as be capable of going after destroyers and potentially harassing a couple of battleships. That means it's hunting some far bigger prey. Now, the more likely, or the later you get, the more expensive your ships are going to get. So a 1940s ship is already going for 200 million. That's without anything on it. Because I'm trying to go for something speedy, I'm looking at the hull form. So the maximum optimal speed is 32 knots, 30 knots, 36.4. Damn. I like that. I personally favor ships which are fast, even if I'm paying more for them. But it allows me to be flexible on the battlefield, moving into positions where favorable, disengaging when unfavorable. So I'm going to go with 36, maybe even 37 knots, which is definitely going to keep me on par with enemy destroyers. Do take note of the increased price and displacement of the ship. The 36 to 37 marker here is what I call a magical barrier, because by increasing it 1 knot, you're going from a lot of displacement, like 41 to 51, and your price increases significantly. If you go to 38 knots, it gets only a little bit worse. 39 is a little bit worse, and probably we're going to run into another magical barrier. The faster you... There we go. 41 knots is crazy. This is basically a hard limit that the devs have set on the cruiser, and they really do not want you to do 41 knots. Back before they did this, you could do a destroyer that could do, what, 60 knots, I think? I have a video on it if you're interested. It was a pretty crazy ship. Now, considering that this thing is going to be a bit more of a long-range predator, against both the destroyers and battleships, I want to make it bigger. So I'm going to go for 9,500 tons. I'm going to max out the range. I'm going to give it a good engine. Now, which engine? That's the question. Considering that I'm going to be at pretty decent ranges away from the enemy, I can go for gas turbines, which means I get more acceleration and more ship repair, but I think diesels are safer. Diesel 2 gives you minus 85% engine damage chance. So if the ship does take a hit and does have the armor get penetrated, this means you're not as likely to reduce your engine's power and, as such, your speed. However, this thing has 58 horsepower per engine ton. You can find that just below the end of the screen there. This means that the engine doesn't put out as much horsepower compared to the gas turbine. The gas turbine has 200 horsepower per engine ton. So look at what happens when I change the engine from the turbines to the diesel. We're looking at 4640 or 48% of the ship. And your ship is going to cost $841 million. It's a very, very expensive light cruiser. If you're going for gas turbines, you're not using as much, but you're paying $1.4 billion for a light cruiser. That's a bit mental. If you're going for gear turbines, you're getting, let's say, a slightly better of both worlds. Your cost is not nearly as much. Your weight is decent. And let's say if I reduce speed a bit, because it's getting kind of ludicrous, your cost isn't nearly as exorbitant. If I go for gas turbines, it's still very expensive. If I go for diesels, it's okay, 535. Let's go for that. I'm going to get the best oil because this means I get more engine efficiency and less engine vibrations. Engine vibrations means that the ship is going to be vibrating because of the engine hum, which is negatively impacting your accuracy. An AUX 5 engine is very nice to have, but also very expensive. Look at the price, 530, 900 million. No thank you, I'll just take an auxiliary engine 2 and call it a day. As for propeller shaft, if you can max this out, that'd be great, especially for the survivability of a light cruiser, because the maximum speed penalty drops by 40% if your engine is damaged. However, it also blossoms the price. I don't want these ships to become, let's say, $1 billion. That would be a bit much. This ship is going to maintain its speed at all primes, so balanced rudder. And let's go for electro-hydraulic steering. I want the best armor. I want to have a single bottom hull. I want to have reinforced bulkheads, anti-flood 3, and a Citadel 5. All or nothing armor scheme. When it comes to capabilities such as dealing with submarines, yes, I'll take depth charges 6 so that on the strategic map this thing also has some usefulness. When it comes to towers, I tend to pick just the best ones because you do get a lot more efficiency from the ship, such as additional torpedo spotting. You're going to be getting potentially better night vision depending on the era and the tech that you have. Which does mean that even if you encounter a nighttime battle, it's going to be more useful. Now, considering that this is going to be a bit more of a skirmisher, so I'm going to be engaging battleships, I also want this thing to have a long-range booster, so it's going to have a better long-range efficiency. I want to have the best sonar, so that I can also spot torpedoes which are coming potentially for my battleships, as well as boost the ASW stat for this ship on the strategic map. To that end, I'm also installing a better radio, and I'm giving it radar rangefinder 3. This is going to give it, again, a hefty bonus to long-range accuracy, and if I ever get into a night battle, I don't get as much of a penalty. Again, I don't care about mine dropping, I don't need that. I do want to get some armor on this ship, and what can we get? 4.5 inches. Yeah, it's still not that much, but we'll just have to live with it. I'm going to go for 4.5 inches all around. Let's say 3 inches there. And because I'm more likely to take hits on the deck, I'm going to go with 3-inch all over. This means that I have about 85% of the ship used just for speed. And that might prove to be a bit much. There we go. 89% engine efficiency is okay. Time for the guns. It is now 1940. And this cruiser is going to get access to Mark V guns. The Mark V is the highest tier that you can get. They get the best accuracy, the best range, the best reload, the best everything. I want this ship to be able to harass enemy battleships. So I'm going to use 7-inch guns because they have the biggest range. This has a range with high explosive of 14 kilometers. This has a range of 15.2. Now you can go for a single, dual, triple, or quadruple barrel. You might be inclined to just jump on the triple barrel and go, more guns, more firepower. Yes, but also more weight. And that does not necessarily help you, because you might not be able to afford, let's say, another turret. In this case, I can probably go with another turret, and I might be able to make the ship out like this. And this would probably work. If you're going to go with more turrets, that doesn't necessarily mean you can engage more targets, but it might give you a bit more flexibility. So, for example, I have a secondary gun. I want to have a 3-inch gun on here, so that if a destroyer gets into range, I'll be able to quickly engage the destroyer. Now, since the game has no aircraft carriers, there is no need to worry about the carriers. As for the gun's stats, barbettes, something very useful. It also means that your flash fire chance goes down. So let's get that down. Let's increase the reload, which tends to increase it a bit. And as for TNT, I'm going to go for TNT 4. Generally the best, but also the most expensive. And yeah, I am paying let's say 1.1 billion for it. And my displacement is almost maxed out. So the 37 knots might be a bit much. Let's put it to 35 knots. And now it's suddenly a lot more reasonable. And I can add more turrets. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add another quadruple barrel. When I'm building a ship out, I tend to look at that turning of the turret. If you press R and T, you're able to rotate the turret. And I want to see if the turret can rotate 360 degrees. Because let's say that you're engaging an enemy there. And then all of a sudden, that enemy is gone and you need to rotate the turret all the way over there. That turret is going to have to pretty much do this. It's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is going to take you a lot of time. If you have a turret that is not obstructed by anything behind it, that turret is pointing this way, and it just turns the other way a bit more like this, and it goes, I can immediately shoot again. So this is very useful, but you can't exactly do it with every single turret. The turret over here cannot do it, because it's going to run into the main tower. And the bridge generally doesn't like it if it suddenly has a couple of barrels going right through it. So unfortunately, we can't quite do that. But of course, if I'm able to get at least another turret and the turret on the stern to immediately snap to a new target, that'd be very helpful. Considering that I am going up against battleships, or at least expecting to harass battleships, I'd very much appreciate it to stay at range. So I'm going to increase the barrel length. And this gives me a range of 24 kilometers. Doesn't mean that you're safe. The enemy battleship is still going to be able to hit you at that range, but not as effectively, or at least not as often. You're also a speedy target. You're not necessarily a huge target, but you are relatively big, and you're able to go and deploy your smokescreen, which means that your accuracy, or at least the chance of you getting hit, drops. So all of those stats definitely help. If you want to get even more out of these 7-inch guns, you can make them 7.9s. And with that, your range increases to 25.6. Now, in this case, it really starts to matter what type of shell you use. You can go for incendiary, which can definitely burn away part of the crew, but it really can't pen much. Your chance to pen armor at, let's say, 20 kilometer range is essentially nothing, because you don't have any armor pen. For this particular ship, as a harasser of battleships, I would recommend high explosive incendiary. You can go capped, but it generally doesn't do that much. It means you can pen, let's say, 20,000 meters. You can pen 0.4 inches, which means that if the enemy battleship has at least some armor on the superstructure, you can't pen anything. So just go for incendiary. Now, for this particular ship, I don't want the 7.9s. I want to go with 7s, because that means I still have a few hundred tons left to add torpedo launchers. The torpedo launchers in 1940 can be really bloody dangerous. They can also be a bit hard to deploy, because especially if you use, let's say, the quintuple, so that's 5 tubes next to each other, they don't necessarily fit as well. In this case, a triple launcher does fit. However, I want to make sure that these are bigger torpedoes. I want to have 24-inch torpedoes on the ship, and now the game is going to go, yeah, that doesn't fit anymore. Lovely. In this case, you can kind of go for a bit of a different solution, if you will. by putting on a barbette, such as, let's say, I think a tall barbette can get away with it. Yep, I can put that there. And then I can put, is this thing free spinning? Yep, it is free spinning. I can put this slightly farther back. Can it still spin? Yes, it can still spin. Again, I'm pressing R and T to do that. And now I can add a quintuple launcher, or two, depending on how much room you have on the back, to add a big torpedo launcher to the stern of the ship. If you have this thing in the standard configuration, you're going to have a range of 16 kilometers. I want to get a bit more range. So I'm going to give this thing either electric torpedoes or oxygens. Electric gives you a bit less range, but your torpedoes are extremely stealthy. They're very, very, very difficult to detect. Oxygens give you more range. They're slightly less more, well, they get about 0.5% or 55% less detection range. So with this, I'm getting up to 23.2 kilometer range, which means a battleship might not be anywhere near where the torpedo is going to be aimed. But if you're targeting a bigger formation, this can still be useful. The problem that this ship does face right now is that if it encounters a destroyer, it is pretty much screwed. Yes, it can still use those 7-inch guns, but they reload in 21 seconds, so I want to boost their firepower a bit. And I'm going to try and fit a couple of 3-inch guns. I can have another one there. Sometimes it pays to go for, let's say, double... Yep, here we go. 2-inchers. You cannot fit the 2-inch quadruples, but you can fit the 2-inch triples. And with this, I can suddenly get a bit more firepower against destroyers. This reloads in 3.7 seconds and can hit out to 8.7 kilometers. Keep in mind, 1940. My torpedoes have a range of 23 kilometers. The enemies might have 2. So in this case, be very, very, very careful. Don't just try and race at a destroyer because you want to get your guns into range, because you might find that your cruiser takes a torpedo to the face and promptly dies. This is a bit of a last resort in case that you're unable to get away from the destroyer if you want to, or if you're unable to get any kind of a hit with these 7-inch guns. I find that rather unlikely, but it's possible that you won't get a hit. So now we have a little bit of displacement available. You can just opt to not use it, or you can upgrade the armor on the turrets. In this case, my top armor on the turrets is quite low, which means that if a shell comes in, again, like this, and penetrates the top of the turret, I'm going to have a very explosive experience. So I want to have the top armor of my turret more armored. And the barbette, which is this piece over here, I want to have that armored up as well. So that's where the rest of my, my weight distribution is going to go. Let's say a bit more superstructure. And that's it. 95.99 for 9600. Now, I'm currently on 1.5.1.6. These stats change all the time. And also really depend on where you put your guns. For example, if I put my guns farther back, the weight distribution is going to change. So sometimes it might fit, sometimes it might not. Don't necessarily look at what I'm doing and try to exactly copy it. Build your own ship, because it's going to teach you a lot more. So this light cruiser, the Columbia, is far more capable of going after bigger prey and serving as a bit of an annoyance to enemy ships. And it probably won't win against a battleship all by its own. But if you have 5 of these little bastards going up against a battleship, they might very well be able to burn down the battleship so much that the entire crew on the battleship dies, or at least 45%. At which point, the enemy ship surrenders. And all of a sudden you have a couple of light cruisers which are winning against, well, a Goliath, potentially up to 150,000 tons. So that is a couple of different ways that you can build a light cruiser. Now with that, I'm going to end the video because we have been talking for about 55 minutes by now. I hope this was useful to you. If you have any questions, by all means, let me know down below in a comment and I'll try to help you along as best as I can. Let me know down below in the comments if you are more experienced, what you use your light cruisers for and how you like to build them. This is Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. You are the Admiral. You pick how you want your light cruiser to be built. Maybe you're going to turn it into a massive torpedo boat, which you can. Maybe you are, I don't know, playing as Japan, which tends to have very favorable torpedo builds. And if you have, let's say, the light cruiser, I think it's the modern light cruiser, you can build out a ship completely different. You can have it as a massive torpedo spammer. Does this work? Oh, yes. Is it fun to use? Certainly. Is it efficient? Meh. I mean, it can be. You're throwing out, what, 30 torpedoes per side? So first you sail this side to the enemy and you turn around and you dump another 30 torpedoes into the water. The problem that I've found with builds like these is that they tend to go down pretty quick. Because torpedo launchers do house a lot of personnel. And when the torpedo launcher takes a hit, it immediately gets destroyed because it doesn't have any armor. And you find that your crew dies and the ship has a tendency to surrender. Anyway, I hope that you found the video useful. If you did, please give it a like so more people can find it. The algorithm and such likes that. Again, questions down below in the comments. And otherwise, best of luck on the high seas and let me know how your battles go. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon for more videos.